everyone, and a warm welcome to this week's special edition of your Energy Frontiers. I am Justina Okechukwu. Coming up in the package, we headline two key events in the week. The first is on climate change and energy crisis, and the second, a window into next week's high-profile Africa Energy Week Summit in Cape Town, South Africa. As the world grapples with the challenges of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, rising inflation, and food insecurity, the 2022 annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank held this week selected a session that's focused on climate crisis and the wider energy issues. Here is an excerpt from the panel.
So we're here today because of the climate crisis, and we're looking at one portion of this challenge, which is how do we create a market that allows more emission reduction, and that has several parts to it. That's voluntary credits, that's mandatory or forced reductions by various countries that can involve trading systems. And so to put it into context for people, we need to find ways to have giant amounts of financing flow to really impactful projects. For example, the decommissioning of a coal-fired power plant takes money. It takes money directly for the work to decommission the plant. But then how do you substitute power, solar panels on top of the land? And what do you do with the people that are displaced or that were involved in the production chain? So all of this gets into a system for the world to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions much more rapidly than we have.
So what are the main roadblocks? What are, when you wake up in the morning and looking at your portfolio and want to do more, what are you seeing as being the main roadblocks?
We, first of all, think in terms of the emerging countries' transition, energy transition, about the size of the challenge, right? You have, in terms of existing emissions, obviously a very low proportion in emerging countries, 25% roughly, if we compare that to the average per capita emission in developed countries. But in terms of the growth over the next 2 decades, you have an expectation at current policies and current projections of a growth of 5 gigatons of emissions, when developed countries will probably go down by 2 and China and the rest of the world will remain flat, meaning there's no way we reach our goals for sustainable development and energy transition for the world if we don't do more in emerging countries.
No, it's very similar to the challenges that you are seeing. We are seeing traditional challenges to invest in emerging economies, which is a cost of development. You are doing project finance, you know that. You say, oh, it's expensive to develop project, but also the risk level. And the risk level has been exacerbated recently with the events that we are having, which are headwind. We are creating a lot of headwinds. We have the war in Ukraine, you have the macroeconomic situation, you have the slowdown in growth, and you have the increased instability in some countries. So all these are increasing the risk level. In addition, to respond to the inflation pressures that most advanced economies are facing and the world is facing, central banks are hiking its interest rate, which is creating a pull factor on the market and to take investment which were willing to go to emerging countries to be redirected to safer assets. So these two factors require now more and more blended finance and de-risking instruments to be able for us to mobilize more resources. And that's really at the heart of the conversation today. And it not affects countries in emerging economies, but it affects also a larger country. If you take a large emerging country, which are the largest emitter, like India, like Indonesia, they wanted, and they are in the process of reducing emission, but they are facing a huge cost of decommissioning some plants which were coal-producing plants, and those type of questions which require additional resources and blended finance to be able to make it affordable and interesting. Lastly, we have the issue of currency depreciation and regulatory framework. We have been working in a lot of countries to have what we call a green taxonomy, which say, okay, this paper is green, this company is doing something which is green or not, but this is still limited at the country level. And when we talk to people who want to develop a capital market and deepen some of the capital market in green, they want to have a regional approach. So we are working towards having green taxonomy which go beyond a specific country, but beyond a specific country, so that when you want to invest in paper, you don't invest in paper for only one country, but for a set of countries which are here. And the last is the issue of currency mismatch, which is always a big problem, particularly in this time, which are complex for all of us. Mm. So what I would like to ask you is, when you have been working on different geographies, you're working in the US, you're working in the most advanced economy, you're looking in large emerging economy, low-income countries, you have a large network of retail banking in Africa. What is the commonality, if there is any, in financing climate change activities in countries?
So it's a very interesting question. I think, first of all, the level of awareness across the world in almost every country, all the ones you mentioned, and with all the situations that they're specifically in, I think the level of awareness about the need to do what is right, to align our human activity to a trajectory that makes us basically survive, right? And protect life on the planet. The awareness now is there all over the world. Second thing, and I alluded to this in my first answer, I think there is a lot of appetite and a lot of funds available to invest in the transition, but they, for now, find more vehicles and more issuers in the OECD countries, right? If you look at sustainable finance today, it's mostly a developed issuers market. And so there's this gap which exists, but the awareness is there, the funds are there, and clearly the investment needs are there. And the good news for a lot of the emerging countries is that they do have a lot of renewable resource, right? I'm sure you know that in Africa you have roughly 40% of the solar resources, 2% only of the production capacity. And so here, once again, there is the understanding of the private money that wants to do the right thing, but also generate return, that there are specific, probably low cost eventually, investment opportunities in the energy transition in a lot of emerging countries. The challenge, as I already said, is how do we make this work, right? How do we make sure that this available money finds its way in the most efficient need?
And that was a panel discussion from the IMF World Bank meetings in Washington this week, focused on how to finance the global low-carbon resilient transition plans. When we return, join us for a curtain raiser on the African Energy Week 2022. This is Energy Frontiers. Welcome back to the program. All is set for the high-profile annual summit of the African Energy Week due in Cape Town, South Africa from October the 18th to the 21st. Ahead of that gathering, market research firm Rystad Energy and the African Energy Chamber put together a panel of discussants a few days ago for a webinar that tracked on oil and gas exploration activities across the African markets. Let's grab a bite of their conversation.
So I'll start by saying I want all our panelists to highlight what their sentiments on the current African exploration is. I would like to start with you, Vena. What's your sentiment on the current Africa exploration activities?
The sentiment for Africa for exploration is actually on the way up. Now, I must say it is coming from a very low in terms of the difficulties that we saw post-2014 and then post the recent crisis. As a result of those crises, of course, revenues reduced significantly. And so as a result, the amount of revenue for investment, for capital investment, as well for investment towards exploration reduced significantly. But then one thing I'm certainly able to say is as a result of the price development, which we have seen in recent years, certainly companies have begun to look at investing much more. And we can certainly see that with some of the things which we're seeing in offshore Namibia, offshore Angola, even in new frontiers like Zimbabwe as well as Cote d'Ivoire. And so we are seeing increased exploration programs which are being signed off, investment decisions that are being made. I think Exxon is drilling next year in Angola. We are likely to see, not we are likely, but we're certainly going to see 2 appraisal wells which are coming up offshore Namibia. That is great news for Namibia and for the region as well.
As the core areas or hotspots of Africa, Africa exploration, has that evolved or changed in current times, Atisha?
Yeah, my answer is yes. So in the larger picture, if we see the whole continent, like Per Magnus has already said, it's a huge continent with 54 countries, vast coastline. Hence, the hotspots for the region, they have never been localized. Some specific countries where we saw continued activity over the time are Angola, Nigeria, Egypt, which have been, even through the downturn of the markets, they have been going on with the activity. It has not been as dead as it has been for some of the other countries in the continent.
Venna, has there been any key trends observed in license round activities in Africa? You're sitting on the ground, so you probably know a little bit more than I do in this regard.
Oh, yes, absolutely. What we have seen is that there's been a 180% shift in the way that governments, regulators approach license rounds. The days of big sign-on bonuses or paying, big fees upfront are over. A lot of what we're seeing now is pretty much data-driven. Governments are bending over backwards to be able to provide access to data to explorers to ensure that they can quicken it. And this is one of the things which the chamber has been advising governments. If you put blockages at the forefront, then you make it difficult for explorers to be able to come in. You pretty much make it difficult for you to be able to get first oil in that sense. So yes, there has been a significant amount of change. We are also seeing much more regular engagement in terms of not just licensing rounds traditionally, but also direct negotiations in that sense.
Thank you for that, Atisha. Yourself and Venna, you spoke really in depth into this. And as you say, there's some surprise exploration activities from the countries like Zimbabwe and Seychelles. So that speaks to me. I mean, obviously, it looks like all the coastal countries are quite, busy in terms of opportunities. And of course, Zimbabwe, not quite coastal. It is landlocked. So that's an interesting one as well. Does that mean there's a need for more exposure or penetration, penetration rates in terms of licensing? Does Africa need more?
So according to me, what I believe is a successful lease round not only depends on the number of blocks that has been awarded, it also depends on the companies who are acquiring the licenses, right? So there has to be a financial backing to do those exploration activities in the lease round awarded. So what we have done is until now, we have discussed all the positivities and painted a rosy picture around exploration in Africa, right? But what we have to understand here is because of the incorporation of this low carbon into the corporate strategy, there has been a monumental shift on how companies are going ahead with their exploration strategies.
Venna, what's your view? Pauso has given us quite a lot of surface conditions here. What are your views in terms of what Africa can do to improve its exposure in terms of licensing?
Yes, one of the things which needs to be clear is geology has to work. We can say all what we want, but it has to be the right geology. And for that to happen, of course, the African countries themselves need to invest. at least initially around data acquisition, to be able to make sure there is a right understanding of the geology which they have to offer, for even to be able to attract people to have a look, particularly when you talk about the onshore countries, the ones which are landlocked, where there is much more of a difficulty to be able to access and take out the oil, if at all you find. I look at countries like Niger, which have done a great job, in trying to open up their country and to open up the basin. There's now a pipeline which is going to go from the Agadez Basin off to Benin, and that is going to open up the country. That's it. But there's a lot. It is significantly underexplored. But for that to happen as well, people need to have easy access to data to be able to make the first move. We need to look at fiscal terms. There's no point having a great geology and having the resources, but then having fiscal terms that are pretty much either seen as predatory or not competitive at all in the market. If at all you don't have the right kind of fiscal terms, people go somewhere else. And so Africans and African countries need to understand that. The work programs need to be reasonable. You need to be able to see what's going on an international basis to be able to provide competitive terms. And lastly, access to data has to be easy, made as easy as possible. That's the name of the game. We are in a transition period where there is a significant push to be able to make sure that there is decarbonization. And so only those projects that can pretty much shorten the time from exploration, from the time you do seismic to the time you have first oil. The shorter the time, the more attractive the project is. If it's going to take long as it takes, as we have traditionally seen in some African countries, where it's taken 10 years from the time you explore to the time you go to market with the oil, then it becomes unattractive for investors.
And that's the package for this edition of your Energy Frontiers, and we thank you for watching. Remember to follow the show on Frontier Africa Report's website and across all our social media handles as indicated on your screen. It's goodbye from me, Justina Okechukwu, and I'll see you next time.